It is July of 1964 at a drag strip in Sandusky, Ohio, and Tony Nancy is going through the timing lights somewhere north of 186 miles an hour when his car simply leaves the ground. Not a wheel comes up first, not a bump sends it sideways. The entire car with Tony Nancy strapped inside it lifts clean off the pavement and goes over backward at speed. He will later say all he could do was duck down inside the wreckage and wait to see when the grass outside stopped moving. Nobody at that racetrack had ever seen anything quite like it because nobody had ever built a car quite like the one Tony Nancy was driving. And here is the part that should bother you. 6 years after this crash, another driver would put his engine in roughly the same place Nancy already had. That driver would get a nickname, a museum wing, and a permanent place in history as the man who reinvented the dragster. Tony Nancy would get a scar and a footnote. In the early 1960s, if you walked through the pits at any major drag strip in the country, every single top fuel and top gas dragster you laid eyes on looked essentially the same. A long, thin, open frame called a slingshot with the driver sitting behind the rear axle and the engine mounted up front ahead of him. That layout had been the standard since the format itself was invented, and almost nobody in the sport was seriously questioning it. The thinking at the time was simple enough. Put the weight over the front wheels for traction. Put the driver behind the axle so he can see and steer. Let the whole thing scream down a quarter mile in a dead straight line. Drivers accepted as a matter of course that they were sitting directly behind a spinning drive line, a clutch assembly, and a supercharged engine running on nitromethane. And that if any of it let go under the kind of stress these cars generated, the driver was going to be the very first thing it hit. Clutch explosions were common enough that racers barely blinked when it happened to somebody else at a different track on a different weekend. This was simply how a dragster got built. Everybody built them the same way because almost nobody had seriously tried building one any other way. And into that world walked a man who had already spent his entire adult life proving he could do things differently than everybody else around him. To understand why Tony Nancy was the one who eventually blew that whole layout apart, you have to understand what kind of man he already was before he ever touched the car this story is really about. Nancy grew up in the San Fernando Valley in the years right after the Second World War when Southern California was becoming the most intense car culture the world had ever seen. Young men came home from the war with mechanical skills and nowhere to put them except into their own vehicles, and Nancy fell in with that world early. He attended Hollywood High School, whose alumni also included a young James Garner, though the two were years apart. By 14, he had taken a job at a local upholstery shop, earning enough to buy his first car outright. He built his first hot rod at 15 and joined a timing association club before he was legally old enough to drive on the street. As a teenager, he apparently ran with a rough enough crowd that a local police sergeant suggested the Marine Corps might do him some good. Nancy took the advice. He served during the closing stretch of the Korean War, stationed on a Pacific island for about 3 years, and came home from it more focused and more disciplined than the kid who left. From that point forward, he was serious about exactly two things: cars and upholstery. The upholstery trade is where you have to spend real time if you want to understand Tony Nancy, because without it, almost nothing else about him makes sense. He learned it from the ground up, starting at 25 cents an hour at a time when a kid sanding cars down the street could make $1 for the same hour of work. Every mistake he made in that shop came out of his own pocket on his own time. He bounced between jobs, picking up everything he could, and one of his early stops was Hillcrest Cadillac in Hollywood. Clark Gable brought a flipped Cadillac coupe in for repair, and Nancy suggested a padded custom top to hide the damage. Gable loved it. Other Cadillac owners started asking for the same treatment, and just like that, a 20-something upholstery hand had his first signature technique. See a problem nobody else has solved and engineer a solution that looks better than the thing it replaced. That instinct ran through absolutely everything Tony Nancy ever built for the rest of his life. By around 1956, he had his own trim shop in Sherman Oaks, specializing in leatherwork for high-end vehicles, and the client list read like a Hollywood premiere. Steve McQueen was a regular. Nancy reupholstered McQueen's Jaguar, which today sits among the most valuable cars in the world. And for a stretch, he even served as general manager of one of McQueen's side businesses. James Garner came through the doors. So did John Wayne and Burt Reynolds. If you were Hollywood royalty in the late 1950s and you cared about the inside of your car, you went to Tony Nancy. And his shop was not just a trim business either. He shared the complex with Kent Fuller, who built some of the most respected dragster chassis in the entire sport, and with Ed Pink, who built engines that other top teams would have killed to get their hands on. Under one roof, you had a trim shop, an engine shop, and a chassis shop, all run by a man who could hold his own doing any one of those three jobs himself if he had to. By the time the 1960s rolled around, Nancy had already built 22 hot rods with his own two hands before he ever raced one competitively. And every race car that followed carried the number 22 because of it. He ran a string of roadsters and dragsters on gasoline through the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, starting with a flathead-powered Model A, running 70% nitromethane in the gas classes and picking up class records along the way. A friend who built his early engines remembered that Nancy wanted a race car specifically so people could see his upholstery work out at the track. Racing began as marketing for a business that badly needed exposure, and it worked exactly as intended. A second version of that same roadster came in 1960, running a stretched Buick nailhead engine. And it landed him a Hot Rod magazine cover in the spring of 1962. A third car came the same year running a supercharged Buick. In 1963, he took home the Winter Nationals title in Competition Eliminator, driving a modified roadster, and picked up a Best Engineered Car award the same weekend, driving a brand new Slingshot that had just come out of his shop. He held down one of the top spots in the country's national rankings for close to 2 years straight. This was not a hobbyist dabbling in gas class racing on weekends. This was one of the fastest and most respected men in that entire branch of the sport, and he had built his reputation the same way he built everything else in his life, alone or close to it with a small handful of people he trusted completely, and nobody else allowed anywhere near the work. That habit of working alone earned him a nickname that stuck to him for the rest of his career. People started calling him the Loner, not because he had been burned by a partner or robbed by a crew member, or because some betrayal in his past had made him bitter and closed off. Nancy explained it himself years later in about as many words. He wanted to be completely different. That was the whole reason. Standing in a pit area full of 3 and 4 and 5 man crews, all working on a single car, Tony. Nancy wanted to be the one man doing every job on his own and doing it better than the crowd around him could manage with 5 sets of hands. He was not cold, and he was not hostile when people did approach him. One fan who used to watch him race at a local strip remembered him as a class act who answered every question thrown at him, and once let a kid sit in the car just to help him work up the nerve to run his own machine that same afternoon. But the circle of people who actually got to put a wrench on his car or design a part of it was small on purpose, and you did not get into that circle by showing up. You got into it by already having proven for years that your work belonged next to his. An engine builder who built Nancy's very first race motor summed up the relationship about as well as anybody could. He simply said he guessed Nancy trusted him to do things right. That was the entire audition. Do the work right the first time and you might get a second call. Get it wrong, and there would not be a third. Which brings us to a designer named Steve Swaja, who came out of the Art Center College of Design with a head full of ideas that had absolutely nothing to do with how everybody else in drag racing was building their cars. Swaja looked at the standard Slingshot layout the same way you or I might look at a house built with the furnace, sitting directly behind the living room couch. It worked well enough that nobody questioned it, but the moment you actually thought about it, the arrangement looked a little insane. Every single one of those cars had its driver sitting a few feet in front of a spinning driveline, a fuel-soaked clutch, and a supercharged engine that everybody in the sport already knew could and occasionally did let go with real violence. Swaja's idea was to flip the whole thing around, put the engine and the driveline behind the driver instead of in front of him, wrap the entire car in an enclosed aluminum body with a pointed nose that covered the slicks, and routed the exhaust out underneath instead of leaving everything exposed to the wind the way every other car at the strip did. Most professional racers who heard a pitch like that in 1963 would have nodded politely, filed it away as an interesting thought experiment, and gone right back to building the same slingshot everybody else was building, because changing the fundamental layout of a car that already worked is exactly the kind of risk a man does not usually take with his own money and his own body strapped inside the result. Tony Nancy heard the pitch and told him to build it. The car got the name the Wedge, and everything about how it came together tells you Nancy was not treating this as some side curiosity to roll out for a photo and park in the corner of his shop. The chassis work went to Frank Huszar and Roy Steen, two men who knew exactly what they were doing when it came to building a frame that could handle serious speed. The aluminum body shaping fell to Emil Deidt, who came out of retirement specifically to take the job, pulling on years of experience from the old Scarab sports car programs and working alongside a young Wayne Ewing to get the shape exactly right. Nancy personally insisted on stretching the wheelbase out to 145 inches, which was noticeably long for the era, and gave the car a completely different stance than anything else rolling into the staging lanes. Underneath that pointed aluminum skin sat a supercharged Plymouth engine somewhere around 428 cubic inches feeding power back through a straight front axle, running small bicycle-sized front wheels with a twin torsion bar setup handling the rear suspension. Picture every other car parked in those pits that season. Open tube frame engine, bolted up front driver sitting exposed behind the rear axle, looking for all the world like a bomb that somebody had strapped wheels onto. Then picture the Wedge rolling in low and pointed and completely enclosed, looking like it belonged at an entirely different kind of race being held on an entirely different planet. It debuted in 1963 running in the AA gas supercharged class, and there was simply nothing else on the property that resembled it in any way. Other crews walked over just to look at it before the first run was even made, and word went around the pits fast that Tony Nancy had built something nobody had seen coming. The car did not just turn heads either, it ran. At the 1964 Hot Rod Magazine Championship Drag Races, the Wedge posted the low elapsed time of the entire meet at 8.51 seconds and 187 miles an hour, blowing away a field full of conventional slingshots built the way everybody had always built them. Hot Rod Magazine put the car on the cover, which for Nancy was familiar territory by now, but this cover was different from the ones that came before it. This was not a gas-class roadster running a class record inside a small niche of the sport. This was one of the fastest cars in the entire country, running a body style and an engine placement that nobody else had committed to. And for a stretch, it looked like Tony Nancy had simply solved a problem the rest of drag racing did not even know it had yet. Confidence like that has a way of pulling a man further out onto a limb than he originally planned to climb. That same year, Nancy took his operation overseas as part of an American drag racing team competing in the first British International Drag Festival, bringing the Wedge along with a front engine car driven by a racer named Deidt. The trip turned rough almost the moment it began. Deuce's front engine car struck a 55-gallon drum of sand that had been set out as a track barrier, and the impact literally tore the car in half. Two pieces of what had been a complete dragster came to rest on opposite sides of the shutdown area, and out of the wreckage climbed Deidt on his own 2 feet. He walked away from a crash that by any normal measure should have killed him, which under the circumstances counted as the good news of the day. It was a preview of exactly how unpredictable this business could turn when you were racing on unfamiliar ground, pushing equipment that had never been fully tested against everything a real competition schedule could throw at it. And it was nothing at all compared to what was waiting for Tony Nancy back home in the United States, only a matter of weeks later. Because the real test of the Wedge was never going to be a magazine cover or a clean, low-elapsed time at a well-organized meet in front of cameras that already knew what they wanted to shoot. The real test was what happened the day somebody pushed a car built completely differently from every other car on Earth all the way out to the edge of what it could physically survive. And in July of 1964, at a drag strip in Sandusky, Ohio, the test finally arrived whether Tony Nancy was ready for it or not. By this point in the season, the Wedge had already done exactly what Nancy and Swaja set out to prove it could do. It was fast. It was stable through the lights at every meet before this one. Track announcers had started introducing it as something worth staying in your seat to watch instead of grabbing a hot dog during the gas class rounds. Nobody watching the car roll into the water box that day in Sandusky had any reason to expect anything different from what they had already seen it do a dozen times that year. Nancy went through his usual routine. He checked the car himself the way he checked everything himself. He strapped in. He staged. Nancy staged the Wedge the same way he had staged it dozens of times before and ran it down the strip the same way he always did. The car came through the timing lights somewhere in the range of 186 to over 200 miles an hour, depending on which account of that day you believe. And at that speed, something happened that drag racing did not yet have a name for. Instead of staying planted the way a race car is supposed to stay planted, the Wedge started generating lift, not a bounce, not a shimmy, that a driver could correct with a twitch of the wheel. The entire car left the pavement at speed and went over backward, with Tony Nancy still strapped inside it. Spectators standing along the guardrail near the finish line watched a car that had been screaming down the strip a half second earlier suddenly rotate through the air upside down, trailing pieces of aluminum bodywork behind it. Track workers ran toward the wreckage the way they were trained to run toward any crash at that speed. Not yet knowing whether they were about to find a driver they could still help. Nancy described the moment about as plainly as a man can describe nearly dying in a race car. He remembered ducking his head down inside the wreckage and simply waiting to see when the grass outside the windshield stopped moving. He had no way of knowing in that moment whether the car was going to keep tumbling or come apart entirely around him. All he could do was hold still and wait. The instant he felt the car finally settle, he punched the harness release and fell out of what was left of his upside-down dragster onto the ground at Sandusky, Ohio. As best the record shows, he was not hospitalized. By his own account, he simply climbed out from under the wreck under his own power, which, given what had just happened to him, is close to unbelievable on its own. What Tony Nancy had run into that afternoon would eventually get a name in drag racing, and the name is blowover. It describes exactly what it sounds like. A car traveling fast enough with the wrong shape sitting underneath it stops behaving like something bolted to the racetrack and starts behaving like something built to fly. The cruel part of the whole situation is that in July of 1964, almost nobody in the sport understood this yet, because almost nobody had ever built a car shaped the way the Wedge was shaped, and then pushed it to the kind of speed Nancy was running. A conventional slingshot with its driver and engine sitting out in the open air simply did not trap air underneath itself the way an enclosed pointed nose body could. The enclosed body and the pointed nose that made the Wedge look so far ahead of everything else on the property were the exact same features that made it aerodynamically unstable in a way its own builders never saw coming. Tony Nancy had built a car so different from anything else in drag racing that he became one of the very first people to discover a danger unique to that specific kind of design. And he discovered it upside down at well over 180 miles an hour with a harness release in his hand and grass filling up his entire windshield. He survived. The Wedge did not. The car that had carried the low elapsed time of the entire 1964 Hot Rod magazine. Championship Meet came out of Sandusky totaled beyond saving, and Tony Nancy came out of it with a very clear first-hand understanding of exactly how far ahead of the rest of the sport his idea had actually been, and exactly what it had already cost him to find out. Most men who had just been thrown upside down at those speeds in a car that had never failed that way before would have looked at the wreckage on the trailer and quietly gone back to the safer thing that already worked. Tony Nancy looked at what was left of the Wedge and started thinking about how to build the next one. He did not wait long to start. Within a relatively short stretch, a second version of the car was already taking shape back at the shop, and this one carried the lessons of Sandusky built directly into the metal. Slots were cut into the bodywork above the slicks specifically to let trapped air escape instead of building up underneath the car the way it had before. The rear suspension that had been part of the original design was pulled out entirely. The wheelbase was stretched even longer than before, and under the new bodywork sat a different engine entirely, a supercharged Chrysler Hemi in place of the Plymouth that had powered the original. Nancy was not simply repairing what broke, he was systematically working through every part of the car car that could have contributed to what happened at Sandusky, and changing it one piece at a time, the same way he had once looked at a dented Cadillac and seen a fix instead of a write-off. The new car kept the name Wedge too, and it would go on to prove that the layout itself had never been the problem. The shape around it had been. Wedge 2 went back out and did exactly what Nancy and Swaja had hoped the first car would do. Prove that putting the engine behind the driver actually worked once the aerodynamics were sorted out. But by the back half of the 1960s, the ground underneath the entire sport was already shifting again. And it was shifting away from cars like this one. When the NHRA lifted its ban on nitromethane in the top fuel ranks, the crowds that used to fill the stands for gas class racing packed up and moved to the other end of the property to watch the fuel cars instead. Nancy had built his entire career and his entire reputation on gas racing, and now gas racing was turning into the undercard. He was in his late 30s. He had 5 Hot Rod magazine covers, a national event title, and one of the most talked about cars the sport had ever seen, and none of it counted anymore in the class that mattered. So he did what he had always done when the world in front of him changed. He rebuilt from the ground up. He called on Woody Gilmore for a new chassis, and Keith Black, the single most respected engine builder in Top Fuel, to build a destroked Hemi. Third run out of the trailer at San Fernando, the new car ran quicker than the track record held by one of the best drivers in the sport. 2 months later, at the 1970 Bakersfield March Meet, Tony Nancy won the whole thing, beating a close friend in the final round. And it turned out to be the last time a front-engine car would ever win that race. The sport he had spent 20 years mastering was already handing the keys to somebody else. And this time, it was not him holding them. Because 6 weeks before that, Bakersfield win, a driver named Don Garlits had been sitting in his own front-engine dragster at Lyons when the transmission let go directly behind him and took part of his foot with it. Garlits rebuilt his own car with the engine moved behind the driver, the same basic idea Nancy had already put on a racetrack 7 years earlier. And when Garlits did it, the entire sport followed him. Within a few seasons, every serious top fuel car on Earth had the engine sitting behind the driver. Garlits got the credit for changing drag racing forever. He earned a museum, he earned a nickname that still gets said with total reverence 50 years later. Tony Nancy got the Wedge into a museum too. It sits today at the Museum of American Speed, one exhibit among many usually described as an early oddity, rather than the machine that proved the whole idea years before anybody else was willing to risk it. Nobody set out to erase what Nancy did. It is simpler than that. Garlits switched because a car nearly killed him, and the story of a man rebuilding himself after a near-fatal crash is the kind of story history likes to tell. Nancy switched back to the safer layout after his own near-fatal crash, and that part of the story mostly went untold, buried under 2 more decades of him quietly doing every job himself the way he always had. He kept racing into the 1970s, kept setting records, and retired in 1976 to run his upholstery business full-time, the same business that had put him at a racetrack in the first place. He died in November of 2004 after a long illness that was never made public, the cause never disclosed by his family or by the sport that had inducted him into its Hall of Fame 13 years earlier. He never spent much time telling people he had done it first. He built the thing. He crashed the thing. He built it again. Then he went back to work. That was always going to be the whole story with Tony Nancy. He was not chasing credit. He was chasing the fix.